Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest Farmers Weekly webinar. My name's Andrew Meredith. I'm the editor of Farmers Weekly, and I'll be chairing the discussion this evening on a very interesting topic indeed, soil carbon farming. What's in it for me? This evening's event is sponsored by Agreena, a Europe-wide company that will help you certify the amount of carbon in your soil and give you a platform to sell it if you wish. But this evening is not just a sales pitch for them. They've given the Farmers Weekly team complete freedom to put as many questions from you to them and our expert panel as you like. And we've assembled a great panel, and we're all really looking forward to getting stuck into this fascinating debate. By the end of tonight, I hope we'll have had a good go answering three big questions. What is soil carbon farming? Who does it benefit? And what do you need to know before getting started? The format this evening will be a short presentation from each of our panelists, and then we'll tackle as many of your questions as possible. Thank you to everyone who's pre-submitted questions already when you registered. We'll definitely get to some of those, but please do keep them coming in the box provided now live, and we'll get to some of those later as well. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be presenting. First up, we have Agreena's Business Development Manager, Thomas Gent. Thomas and his family were early adopters of regenerative farming techniques on their 900 hectares of mostly arable land in South Lincolnshire. He was the first UK farmer to join the Agreena carbon programme and now collaborates with the firm to bring other farmers on board. Then we'll hear from Rob Waterston, who's farm manager at the Welford Park Estate in Berkshire. Rob has also been working with Agreena as part of his bid to make the 864 hectares of arable land he oversees into a no-till, carbon-neutral farming system. Third up will be agronomist Mike Harrington, who is the founder and director of the agronomy-based consultancy company Edifos, which has a philosophy focused on improving soil and plant health, and therefore a strong interest in all things carbon too. Finally, we're delighted to also be joined by Susan Twining, Chief Land Use Policy Advisor with the CLA. Her role is focused on farm policy, natural capital, and the carbon markets. So some great insights from her on the way too. And prior to joining CLA, she worked for ADAS. A panel packed full of knowledge, I'm sure you'll agree. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself now and hand over the floor to Thomas for the opening presentation. Thomas, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Andrew. Brilliant introduction. Thanks for listening, everybody. I know it's a wonderful sunny day out there. I'm sure some people are on some tractors. Can we have the slides up, please? Can we? I can't see them, are they? Not yet.
Why don't you make a quick start, Thomas, and our technical team will work on getting those up as soon as possible. I'm sorry to make you ad lib.
That's
here
okay,
we go.
No worries. I wasn't sure how long to wait. Yeah, so as Andrew said, I'm Thomas Gent. I'm mostly a farmer. We've got a farm in South Lincolnshire, really on the Lincolnshire-Cambridgeshire border. Our farm's pretty much split in half on either side of that border. We've been farming or on the regenerative farming journey, moving towards no-till and away from heavy cultivation for around 13 years now across our 900 hectares. Completely combinable crops, arable land. We've introduced herbal lays, grass lays more recently into rotation to try and widen that. My granddad is also the patent holder on a direct drill coulter, which is licensed to weavings in the UK and Europe and licensed to other companies around the world. So it's really interesting to see how this is working all over the world. So why am I here? Why do I work for Agreena? So really in the first COVID lockdown back in spring 2020 now, I think it was, I had a bit of time on my hands essentially, and I knew we was farming in a very different way to a lot of other people, and I knew we was doing some really good things for the climate and the soil, but nobody was rewarding me for it or recognizing me for that. So I kind of set about trying to find how do I make the most of this opportunity. I knew I was doing something different. How can I find a way to get some reward and recognition for that? And I tried lots of different things. I looked into lots of different ideas, and soil carbon became something that was really interesting to me, and everybody was talking about. So being a bit young and I think naive back then, I set myself a bit of a challenge. Can I create some carbon offsets or some carbon certificates from my farm, from the practices I was doing? And I set myself that challenge back in the first lockdown. Little did I know how complicated I thought it was back then. But I tried lots of different systems out. I tried lots of different ways of doing it. I tried doing it myself a little bit, and I couldn't find a way to do it until I came across Agreena. So I came across Agreena to January 2021. So yeah, a year and a bit ago now. And I met one of their founders, Ida, online actually on LinkedIn. And she had a really good system that seemed to be working in Europe. So I said, please can I use it on my farm? And she said, of course, as long as you welcome some other UK farms on as well. So actually me and Mike both looked at it then and sort of thought it was pretty good. So we went about, Mike helped us talking to the first farmers. So just a little bit about Agreena. Agreena is a Danish ag tech company. It was started in 2016, I believe, by two ladies. It started off as a grain trading platform, mostly focused on kind of Eastern Europe, allowing farmers to trade grains, much like Graindex we have in this country. Then more recently, around the same time I started looking at it, actually, around 2019, 2020, they started to look into the opportunity of soil carbon and helping farmers certify that and produce a certificate that's verified, that can be traded on the market. So Agreena launched the program, and 2021 harvest was our first year. I was one of the first farmers in the UK, and we also have Rob here who was also in that 2021 program, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go along. So yeah, 2021 was our first year. We've pretty much completed our first year, and we're now busy talking and engaging to farmers for our 2022 season. Can we just go to the next slide, please? So I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit quite in detail, but this is just a little quick summary of how the process works as a farmer. We try to break it down as simple as we can. The first process on our system is to come on, sign up, make a login onto our online system. The next thing is to add your fields. We do everything on a field by field basis. So the first thing is to create your fields and the field definition, the background of the field, what soil type it was, what pH levels is it, that kind of thing. What's the background of this field? The next thing is the field strategy. What are you going to do on this field in this year? What's your plan? And this is a really good planning tool for farmers. They start to, my dad and me definitely use it to start to plan what's the best thing for both an agronomic point of view, but also a carbon point of view on this field. Should I plant a cover crop along with a spring crop? Is that going to be better than a winter crop? All that kind of thing. So that allows you to have a bit of a planning system. Then you go away, carry on your harvest, your season as normal. After harvest, we just ask you to come back to us and tell us your field actuals. What actually happened after harvest? What yield did you get? What did you end up doing? How different was it from your plan? It's usually quite different in farming. We all know that. Then we've got the next little step, which is our circle. You can see there. We can talk about that in a bit more detail. But that's our kind of proprietary methodology, and we work with auditors and various technologies to be able to produce the certificates. Once the certificates are produced, they're issued directly to the farmer, and the farmer decides what he wishes to do with them. We can then see, we kind of summarize 3-4 different choices he may have. Generally, the choices are, to sell them through the voluntary carbon market, to use them himself, or keep them. Or I think the exciting opportunity going into the future is going to be selling it along with your grains or up through the supply chain as an inset. I think that's going to be a big opportunity going forward, and I'm sure we might touch on that in the next hour or so. I think that's it from me. I wanted to leave as much time as we can for lots of questions. It's always a good discussion. So I'll hand over to the next person.
Perfect. Take it away, Rob.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so my name is Rob Waterston. I'm the farm manager for the Welford Estate Partnership in Berkshire near Newbury. We have a 860 hectare arable unit. If I just give you a brief sort of overview of what's happened over the years. We sold the plough in 2012 and we sort of switched to a intensive tillage system. We were just growing winter barley, oilseed rape and winter wheat, which worked really well, but the signs were there that the system was faltering. So 2016, we grew some spring barley for the first time. And then on the back of that in 17, we decided to try a few cover crops. And just to see what the effect really was on soil health, the ability to mop up any sort of surplus nutrients left over from the harvest. And that worked quite well. And if we fast forward today, we're now growing 50% winter wheat, some winter beans, and the rest is spring barley and spring oats. So all the spring crops now follow a cover crop. We do graze a few of the cover crops depending on soil conditions. We don't have any sheep, so we obviously rely on finding some sheep as well. So we've been using lots of biosolids in the past. We have a muck straw arrangement, but we try on the whole to chop as much straw as possible. So the next big step for us, 2018, we sold the primary cultivator and we purchased a strip till drill. We got some grant funding for that, which helped. And then in 2019, we also purchased a direct drill, which sort of started this journey for us really. So I'm lucky enough to have 2 drills. We can pick and choose which drill to use where we see fit. We've had a few problems, it's not perfect, and there'll be some more problems, I'm sure, in our sort of journey, but we are definitely focusing more on crop nutrition, soil health. We're trying not to rely quite so much on chemicals, but they still have an important part in our system. So if I just have to have my one and only slide, please, Laura. So if you look at carbon, this is a very simplistic chart, but we've been soil testing like most farms, every year, and we've been monitoring our organic matter levels, which in most cases have been slowly but surely improving. So they range from 3.2 to 6.3 based on the loss of emission analysis. So we've got work to do, and unfortunately in some cases we've seen small reductions in organic matter. So we need to understand what's caused this and address this going forward. But the first thing for me that really struck me was I did a carbon audit, and this is a bit of a summary of that. And I hadn't really appreciated the sort of the soil's ability to sequester CO2. And if you look on that graph, building organic matter, there's 3,500 tons of CO2. So soil is quite a powerful resource if we get it right. So this is what got me thinking, and like Thomas said earlier, does this have any value? So after lots of discussions with the family who I work for, we decided to give it a go and submitted all our data, and then for the 2021 harvest, and we have had secured some certificates. So that's given you a real sort of snapshot of what we do at Welford and our journey to date. Thank you, Andrew.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rob. Be great to have your insight as somebody doing this on the front line later on. We look forward to that, and somebody else with experience of what it's like at a muddy bitch level, as well as Tom and Rob, is of course Mike. Mike, over to you for your presentation.
Well, good evening, everyone. Although regen farming is the perfect phrase, we like to talk about farming really as intelligent decision making that allows nature, the farm, the soil and the crop to function at its most efficient. It takes a multifaceted approach and a dynamic understanding of how we integrate nature and food as a holistic package, but using wisdom and knowledge to best effect rather than the reliance on nitrogen and chemicals. All natural systems are driven by carbon. As the science of biology increases and we begin to understand the importance of life in soil, many arable farms are moving away from intensive farming systems effectively driven by nitrogen to a more biological carbon-based system. Intensive soil movement, high nitrogen, high chemical usage has over time denatured and decarbonized soil, reducing its ability to function as a living system. The carbon-based approach is about how we regenerate soil to be able to function, to be able to connect, capture, recycle and release nutrients from what should be really a huge living world underneath our feet. Carbon becomes the driver of the system, releasing nitrogen as part of the soil cycle rather than being bypassed with applied nitrogen chemicals. A weed, disease, insect or a nutrient becomes a sign of weakness within the system. For many arable farms, there are practically really only three ways to capture carbon. It's manures, grassland and cover crops, or all three. And for many, the cover crop is a scheme is the basis to start. Could I have my first slide, please? So for many farms starting, cover crops can be disappointing. Straw incorporation doesn't work. The soil isn't in a state to digest fungicide-coated lignum. The cover crops are difficult to establish, generally going in later. Doesn't allow enough time really for the cover crop to reach a growth stage and therefore cannot offer much help for the soil. We can see on the right here that in many cases buying a direct drill is not necessarily the best thing to do. We have to think about these options really, about how we introduce them into a changing system, and it requires a little bit more thought or process perhaps in some cases. So just drilling a cover crop 10 days earlier can double biomass. And I think this is one of the reasons why so many people looked towards schemes like the AB14 or AB15. They give time for growth, natural soil recovery and carbon capture. And grass is something we would really like on all farms if possible. The second slide, please. For most, taking a crop off in May or June isn't an option, but look at what we can achieve when we do. There becomes a huge above ground connection to the atmosphere, capturing nitrogen and carbon, whilst the large, expansive root systems connect with the soil, giving exudates and collecting nutrients. This has a huge and immediate impact on improving soil health. So this was a farm that took wheat off at the beginning of May as a forage crop. And this was a King Super 10 cover crop, which was actually planted the first week of June. In 11 weeks, we managed to achieve 56 tonnes biomass. So total dry mass above ground of 7.5 tonnes. And we sucked out of the ground and the atmosphere 350 kilos of nitrogen and 260 kilograms of potassium. This has a huge impact on how the soil functions and changes. And in many cases, we are beginning to have to think of ways to consider how we can put these carbon capturing crops at a time when they can do the most effect. And some farms that we go to see, after 10 years of using a modest cover crop, maybe once in 4 years, actually don't achieve much because the soil needs a lot more energy and carbon to be able to facilitate the energy for change. Next slide, please. And we can see here the effect of that particular cover crop on the soil. You can see the fine root structures. When we dig down, we were finding actually root systems down to 1.5 meters. And this is one of the reasons that we can collect so much potassium, is that we're drawing from depths that we wouldn't normally get our cereal crops at. So we are high carbon, nitrogen, nutrient scavenging, huge physical and soil life impact. Can I have the next slide, please? So what we're trying to do is to explore options and new ideas to develop cropping and rotations, creating flexibility to allow cover cropping, companion cropping, relay cropping, the best potential really to naturally regenerate soils and build diversity. And technology is really being helpful here. So we've got on the left the system chameleon, which is a drill which can be used as an inter-row hoe, but also be able to drill in between rows. The principle is, can we start packing crops on top of each other, or could we establish the following cover crop within the crop so that once the crop comes off, we have a huge potential for this quick growth? The one on the right is an inter-row mower, a system designed by Andy Cato from Farm Wilded, and we're looking at strip tillage really, and it's exactly the same process. Can we start to integrate and stack crops on crops within the system? It's really quite exciting at the technology and innovation that's coming into farms. And I think actually, can I have the next slide, please? Just to finish, really, there has always been farms that have managed to balance carbon and nitrogen, and there have always been farms which have been naturally regenerational farmers. And here really is just an example of a beef unit with grass and manure that's growing wheat at the moment. This picture was taken last week. The fact is that it's had no fungicides. It's just had 9 kilos of foliar nitrogen. And we generally do not achieve the size of flag leaves in artificial nitrogen chemical systems. So good low farming input systems there were out there before regen came along, and they're still carbon driven. So you don't have to go to huge lengths to be a carbon farmer. I think it's just this idea of really of understanding where your strengths and weaknesses lie within the system. And what I really love about the carbon trading is that it allows us to begin to understand that carbon is an essential element, as important, if not more so, than nitrogen. And if that is the case, simply by being part of this process, we will begin to consider carbon as part of our farm system going forward. Thank you.
Fantastic. And our final rural professional for this evening then, Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. And good evening, everyone. So at the CLA over the last few years, we've had a strong focus on climate change, helping our members to understand what net zero means for the industry and for their individual businesses. This goes beyond farming in most cases. It includes woodland, but as most rural businesses also touch on other sectors such as energy, housing and transport, we're covering the whole range. One of the key issues or the key focuses that we've had is on the emergence of the voluntary carbon markets and the role of nature-based solutions to remove carbon and reducing emissions. Voluntary carbon markets are what we're talking about here, where you can enter into markets and get value for the carbon that you've sequestered. It's estimated that about 65 to 85% of the growth in the voluntary carbon markets is going to be supplied by these nature-based solutions. That's the things that we as farmers can do to deliver carbon sequestration and reduce emissions. So that's certainly in the short term before other technological advances in carbon capture are available. So these markets present an opportunity for income. There's an increasing demand. The carbon prices are forecast to rise, and the supply is currently not being met. Afforestation and peatland restoration are the most advanced of the nature-based solutions, having agreed carbon codes available that set out on the monitoring, reporting and verification. That's something that others have mentioned tonight. That is an absolutely crucial part of these markets, is that monitoring, reporting and verification. Other codes are being investigated for hedgerows, other natural habitats and of course soils. And this evening we are focusing on soil carbon farming. So as we've already heard, soil carbon is important to all farming. That is not in doubt at all. However, with the emergence of payments for public goods and DEFRA policy and new private sector markets for carbon credits, these voluntary carbon markets, the question many farmers and land managers are asking is whether their soil sequestration and emission reduction is a marketable product and a new income stream, and what are the risks and opportunities. So question one for tonight that I asked myself: carbon markets, Wild West or an opportunity not to be missed? We know that agricultural soils contain large amounts of stored carbon and have the capacity to sequester and store significantly more. Some analysis estimate that the sequestration potential across the UK in soils is between 1 and 2 tonnes of CO2e per hectare per year. And with the voluntary carbon offset markets currently between £10 and £20 per tonne, it is quick to get to some large figures of 200 to 750 million pounds per year for soil carbon sequestration potential. So we all know that building soil carbons is a good thing. The question is whether you should turn this act of carbon sequestration into more than just producing good soils, improving your crops, improving resilience, reducing flood risk, improving water holding capacity, and reducing soil risk. Should you actually turn it into an income stream? So Rob and Thomas clearly say yes to that, and they've explained why and how they do it. There are many advantages. You can continue to produce crops and livestock on the same land. One of the really good points about it is that it does help you to establish a baseline, and that's a really good place to start if you don't know what else to do on this marketplace. There's also a verified process that will help you on that decarbonisation journey, or that to help yourself and the country decarbonise. And there are also choices of how you use the credits or certificates. You can either use them yourself, or you can sell them, or you can add value through when you sell into the supply chain. So there are potentials for income sources and for adding market value to what you're selling. So my next question is, how do you decide if this is the right thing for you or not? And what should you consider when you're thinking about selling carbon? So I've got 6 points here. Firstly, it is worth recognising that this market is in its infancy. It has been operating around the globe, and there are good examples operating elsewhere. But certainly in the UK, it is still in its infancy, and it will evolve over time. So you need to think about your business and the market you're in, and what might be important now and in the future, in particular your own net zero ambitions and the challenges you might face in reaching that. Then you need to consider what you are selling and how that affects your business. So if you're selling carbon offset credits that are outside the supply chain, then you can't claim those against your own emissions now or in the future. They're gone. If you're selling carbon offset credits within the supply chain, then you still can't claim them against your own emissions now or in the future, but there might be some benefits in your supply chain relationships. The third one is if you're being funded by the supply chain to verify your emission reductions and removals for the environmental responsibility rather than to sell as offsets, then you can use those credits for your own carbon balance. So you need to just be thinking about which of those markets, which is important to you, and recognise what you are actually selling. So the third thing to think about is how this might develop. One of the key challenges with soil carbon sequestration in particular is to meet the principles of a high integrity offset. That sounds a wee bit jargony, but that is what is being talked about in order to provide confidence in the marketplace in all these carbon markets for buyers and sellers, and to avoid accusations of greenwashing and associated reputational risk. High integrity offsets, and there's a number of principles that need to be followed in order for it to be a high integrity offset. This is being looked at by the team that are leading the development of the UK Farm Soil Carbon Code. There's 2 points within that I just want to raise. The first one is about additionality, which means that you can only be paid for additional removals, not for maintaining the store. We can argue that one later. But basically, you know that not all soils are the same. They've all got different current levels and maximum soil organic matter levels that can be reached. So it may well depend on your management and the land use as to what you might be able to sell and how much further you can go. There's a second one within the principles is a particular challenge for soil carbon, and that's the need for permanence. So this isn't just about sequestering the carbon into the soils, it's about keeping it there for long-term storage. Woodland and peatland have 30-year requirements. For the engineering solutions to carbon capture, it's much longer. You're looking at about 100 years. So we just need to be thinking about how that pans out within how you're managing a carbon market. Fourth point is, how does the carbon market, the carbon offer sit alongside other schemes, such as the DEFRA Sustainable Farming Incentive in England, and the other schemes coming through in Scotland and Wales. At this stage, DEFRA has been clear that it is possible to go into private sector schemes alongside their schemes, provided there's no double counting. But that needs to be kept in mind. Fifth point, if you're a tenant, you need to ensure that you've got the necessary management control and require permissions from the landlord in order to be able to take this opportunity. And then the final point is, as with any contract, it's important to understand the terms and conditions, what you're expected to do, and what happens if something goes wrong. So in summary, I don't think there's a single answer to my question. I don't think I've answered my own questions. There's no single answer to whether you should enter into a soil carbon agreement now or in the future, or if ever. That's for the individual business to decide based on their own circumstances. But I think it's clear that whatever you do decide, taking action to improve soil carbon and soil health is definitely a good place to start. Thank you.
Fantastic. Some really thought-provoking questions there for everyone considering this on the call. So thank you very much, Susan, for teeing us up there. Let's go straight to our first question then, without any further ado. There's plenty come in and plenty pre-submitted, as I say, but we'll take a live one first. Thank you, Darren Ward, for this question, I think, which also was reflected in many of the pre-submitted questions, Thomas. This one's for you. And he simply asks, to sell carbon credits, do you first need to reach a net zero position on your farm?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's definitely something that's debated. I kind of think Susan touched on it slightly as well. I think that the tricky thing in the market is for a farmer right now to decide what to do. So what the position we've took at Agreena is that we're going to allow you to make your own decision as a farmer, because every year your priorities may change, and where you put that asset may change depending on the value you can get. So what we do is, when we issue certificates that you've produced in your year, in your crop year, we issue those certificates to you as a farmer, and you decide what you want to do with them. You may choose this year the best value for yourself is to keep them, make yourself carbon neutral, and then claim that somehow in the supply chain and maybe get a premium for your product. That might be the best option for you as a farmer. But the thing that we really believe in, and I really believe in, and this is really the main reason why I joined Agreena as opposed to some other systems, is that level of control over what you want to do should be the farmer's. And if the year he decides he needs to be net zero, he does that. And if in another year he gets the best value through selling that to a company that's looking to buy it, he should be allowed to do that as well. That should be his choice. So that's our position on that. Does that make sense?
I think so. So what you're saying is, providing there's more soil in the ground after 12 months than there was at the starting point, effectively a credit is generated.
So a credit on our system, a credit is generated. We I would like to describe it as you harvest your certificates when you harvest your crop. So at the end of your wheat crop, for example, while you're harvesting your wheat and putting that in the shed, you can kind of also imagine that you're harvesting some carbon certificates. And obviously the yield that you've gained in that year is going to depend on the practices that you've done in that year. If you've grown a lot of cover crops in that year, then you're probably going to yield a bit more certificates. But then, once those certificates are in your kind of virtual bank account, if you want to call it that, it should be then your decision to decide what you want to do with them. Currently, you don't have to be carbon neutral to sell on the voluntary carbon market. Maybe that will come in the future, but that is currently not a requirement.
Rob, this whole measurement process, awful lot of questions around that too, and thank you to everyone who's asked questions on that. I won't pick on one because there's several, but how difficult was that process? First of all, is that quite laborious? Is it an office-based task, or are you out with a spade? What do you actually have to do, and how do you do it?
Yeah, it's quite time-consuming. It would be lovely if I could connect my cropping plan or my computer program that I do all my crop records to the Agreena site. Hopefully that's going to come, but yeah, it's a bit laborious. You need all your soil analysis, but it's very thorough. And the audit process again was, they do sort of grill you quite hard, so which gives you confidence, to be fair. in what you're trying to achieve. So, but it's not a 5-minute job.
Okay, and Thomas, just to come back to you, we'll get to our other panelists, but there's a lot of questions about whether, you know, the accreditation and whether there's so many different measurements out there at the moment. You know, which one do Agreena use, and how can farmers have faith in it? It's giving one reading and a different system giving another. Is that carbon really in the ground or not? How does it work?
It's a really good question. I think the science and the systems and all of these things are evolving. You know, Susan said it. This is the start of this market. This is the start of this market globally. But what we've done in our first year is we've used the Cool Farm tool, which I'm sure a lot of you know or heard of at least, which is kind of an industry standard carbon calculation system. And then we've used ISO standard, ISO 14064, so to bring that international integrity into the system. And as Rob said, I'm glad he's enjoyed the audit process, and it's produced in the, you know, the integrity in the system is massively important, especially at this early stage of the market. We need to be happy and confident in what we're doing. But yeah, at the minute, it's essentially a computer-based task. We're also calibrating the models as we go as well.
This is a really important point, isn't it, Susan? And I know you touched on it there, as Thomas said. You know, how close are we to a sort of universal carbon measurement? That's what we're aiming for, right? Something that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it would be good that everyone had confidence that whatever tool they were using, they were going to be getting the similar answers in terms of the carbon auditing process. There is work going on, I understand, to look at a sort of an Uber standard to ensure that they're all complying to a certain way of doing things, so that they're all going to have taken into account the same sorts of things. And I think that will be a big step forward. They're all good, and if you can use the same one consistently, you will get good comparisons. And really what you want to be looking at is what's happening in your own farm, your own holding, and making improvements based on what you're doing. So in some respects right now it doesn't matter too much, so long as you're using one of them and monitoring what you're doing in terms of your overall emissions and sequestrations. There's some interesting work going on in the monitoring, reporting and verification area around measurements, in particular using things like LiDAR for measuring above ground carbon, which is basically taking aerial images and measuring what the carbon is in trees and hedgerows, for example. Still some way to go on that one, but that makes life a lot easier and more accurate, and it helps the buyers know that there's robustness in the measurement. And similarly, you could use soil testing. I think the soil testing for the soil carbon itself, but I think there's still some work to go on there for everyone to feel very confident about the sampling processes and the results that come from that. But that's coming through in the DEFRA Soil Sustainable Farming Incentive. There'll be a requirement within that to do soil organic matter tests on a rotating basis. So that's going to be the start of that record keeping. I think the important thing is to actually start doing the measurement now. Get your baseline sorted now, because without a baseline, you don't know where you are and what you could deliver and what you could improve on.
Mike, are you helping a lot of people who are right at the start of their journey on this, the initial measurement before they even get to the stage of thinking about what they do with those credits? You're on mute, I think, Mike.
Yeah, sorry. The first year that we were involved with Agreena, really, it was actually quite simple, because all the people that joined up were the people who have been working for 8 to 15 years to create a system which is a carbon builder. It's gone through highs and lows and created a system which fitted Agreena perfectly. And I sort of view this really as that This was simple. We build the system first, and actually the carbon trading fitted in quite nicely. I think probably for a lot of people looking at this as a first approach, maybe, is that there are huge questions about how the farm is going to be farmed in the future, where people want to go with farming. And I feel really the regen approach is a first discussion point rather than the carbon trading. What I loved about the carbon trading is the fact is that we can talk about carbon as an important element, and we don't. Nitrogen is an important element, and so therefore on the platform of Agreena we can start to look at what happens when you change your cropping, what you can achieve in terms of potential carbon capture, which, you know, to me, whether you sell the credits from an agronomist point of view is neither here nor there. I would like us to create a farming system where carbon is the driver and how we develop going forward. And it all falls into place. And when we started, really, you think about our field and cropping as quite an individual, singular approach. But as each year goes by, we are beginning to expand our horizons. So now we're looking at the schemes, environmental schemes, to how we can connect with nature to reduce the cost of farming, and right up the other end, we're looking at our effects of managing carbon are now being rewarded, and so it becomes a huge holistic system, and it has huge implications. It's not just one thing or the other. It's about talking about the farmers as a holistic approach.
Fantastic. Thomas, I'll come back to you. A pre-submitted question from Lukey Isaacson. And, you know, there's a few parts to his question, but I'll sort of summarize it. You know, he wants to know about how simple this is, first of all, and he's also concerned about greenwashing. Are there companies sort of on the other end of these trades, if farmers choose to sell, that we're just sort of bankrolling them in carbon terms to let them carry on doing as they were while we're doing all the hard work effectively?
It's a really, really good question. So the first part on the simplicity, how simple is it for a farmer? We kind of went through the process in my slide, but we've tried to make it as simple as possible, essentially. So what you do essentially is you come on the system, you input as many or as few fields as you wish. We do everything on a field by field basis. So as many or as few fields as you kind of wish to submit to the program. Then you tell us the data, the background of that field, and then what you're going to do on this field in this year. And we can calculate and produce certificates from that. We then obviously have an auditing and a verification process which comes. But for the farmer, that process of inputting the data is kind of the main sector. Once that's happened, it's then sort of down to the audit, and then if he wishes to, decide what you want to do with your certificates that you're now yielding and producing, and thinking about optimizing them as well, which is always a really interesting conversation with the farmer. Is what actually is the practices that make the most difference on my farm? How is that going to fit in with the rest of my farming practices? That kind of thing. So then the second part of the question, what we're going to do with these certificates now we've got them, is always the fun question with the farmer. So we've now got this new asset, right? We've got this new certificate, and there's lots of things you can do with it. If you decide, obviously, we offer a service where we'll go to the voluntary carbon market and we'll find the best price and we'll trade it for you. If you decide to do that, we have a buyer screening policy that we work to. So when companies come and ask, please, can we buy some certificates from you? We kind of assess their green credentials as a business before we accept them to buy. So things like having a publicly stated net zero target, showing us that they've done their own carbon calculations. Things like this are the things that we look at before we accept a sale, basically, and a buyer. I think it's really important to recognize that, as Susan said, actually, this voluntary carbon market is growing. Companies are, they're spending large amounts of money on this type of thing, and they're not doing it with their eyes closed, right? They're doing this, to meet targets that they've set, and they're doing this as their own transitional journey into a net zero business. So it starts to put a price on their own carbon emissions. So it starts to, they start to think about, how can we reduce this so we can buy less certificates next year, and we can do better as a business for themselves. All the businesses we work to, I would say, have net zero targets, and buying carbon offsets is part of that transition to that system.
Who wants to take this next question on? From Glenn Buckingham. Thank you for joining us this evening. Glenn from Helmingham Estate Farmers. He asks, to what depth do we assume the organic matter content, and how do we very soil mass and therefore the tons per hectare of organic matter. This link between organic matter and carbon is so crucial, isn't it? Mike, you're one of the technical experts on the call. Do you want to take that one on first of all?
I don't know whether I can answer it actually. I suddenly thought we did some measurement on some 50-year-old pasture land, and we got down to 1 3/4 meters, and we were still at 6% organic matter, and the top was 12%. So, I've always felt that we talk about carbon building, but actually farming is about carbon cycling. And from my point of view, our problem has always been in the past is that we've burnt off more carbon by farming than we've collected, and we need to redress the balance. And so some farms, lighter soils, are never going to get much above 5% organic matter because they burn out quickly. The important thing for me really is how you balance inputs and outputs. And the dilemma really has been with excess nitrogen, because and high soil cultivations, we've been burning carbon away. And to capture carbon in the first place, we have to find a farming situation whereby we can capture more nitrogen and replace the purchased nitrogen. And so it becomes a much bigger approach. And I understand there's a lot of questions I've been reading through, actually. I thought really interesting. But we are coming to fine lines where actually the farming system is actually a more flowable, if you like. And I think really that we have to look at basics to begin with, how to begin to change the system going forward. I don't know whether that's an answer to that question. But it's my reply, I guess.
Well, even if we've left Glenn with a few more questions to go and pursue some more food for thought, then I think we've started the journey for people in their minds at least. Rob, on your farm, a question from me actually now, but I think again which sort of tries to encapsulate some questions that have been coming in. Farming for carbon. Are there any times where it comes into conflict with what you might call the traditional objective of farming, the food production, or are these two tracks always in parallel and always complementary? Have you made life more difficult for yourself, I suppose, is what I'm trying to ask you.
I think, we're probably in that transition phase at the moment. So everything's not going quite as you'd like sometimes, but we're not farming for. We're not sort of solely farming for carbon, but you can. One of the things I like about the platform is you can play around with different scenarios to see what, if everything you say is going to happen, you can see the net results in terms of your potential carbon certificate. So, but at the moment, we're still not solely farming for carbon, but it's there in the background. We are trying to maintain and build organic matter. That's we're trying very hard to do that. So so hopefully in time, as the system and the soils hopefully improve, carbon will be like the icing on the cake. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think it sort of comes down back to what Mike said as well. It's not just about carbon, right? Carbon is the thing we're talking about now, and it's the thing that we can now produce a certificate from, we can get some income for. But it's just such a holistic approach to so many different factors kind of feed into this, and it shouldn't really be looked at as, I don't think, as solely one thing or another thing. It's how does this work on your farm with all of these different situations that you're in and all of these different factors that affect it. And carbon's just kind of a consideration that's really excitingly now part of that picture, where you've never really been able to think of it, or it's never really been part of that before.
Can I just sort of add something? We've got a couple of farmers now who have been on the Agreena system for a year, and what they're looking at is the carbon credits, is to allow them to move deeper into this carbon system. So it allows them to part fund stripper headers or crimper rollers, all of a sudden, or maybe some cover crops or trials or something, So what it's doing, it's tuning people to think that what can we do more to get more. And I quite like that. I think it's a part of how it's a funding system they're using in different ways.
Susan, I want to come back to the point you made about the supply chain. You're saying about how these credits are they likely to be needed to be generated by farmers to demonstrate their carbon neutral credentials? Is this something all farmers effectively are going to be asked to do, or a lot of them in the future, and people jumping on board with Agreena now are sort of just getting a head start at that effectively?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we know. I mean, many of the supermarkets are looking for net zero supply chains. So they want to be buying from a supply chain that is effectively net zero, but they're not necessarily talking about individual farms being net zero. I mean, there's lots of arguments for and against that. Many farms wish to become net zero. Not everybody can become net zero without having to buy offsets themselves. So if you're a small dairy farm without any land that can go into trees or anything, then you may well struggle to become net zero. So there are difficulties with that. I think the direction of travel will be towards net zero. The question is the timescale. And I wouldn't be surprised that, if you flip forward 25 years, we'll look back to today and wonder what on earth we were worrying about all this for, because it will just be something that will be part of our everyday life, that we need to be looking after the carbon and making sure that we're not emitting more than we're sequestering. How that's actually achieved is the big question. There are quite a few different options being put forward at the moment, and how that might work, whether it's an industry-based trading scheme or whether it's an individual farm base that you need to do. At the moment, there's no requirement to be net zero. It's just a case of looking at your own business and deciding whether it's right for you to be heading in that direction. And nobody's expecting you to be net zero overnight. I think this is a pathway. This is about looking at the issue and going in the right direction.
I can hear a lot of groaning about potential future more red tape, but because it's speculation, we probably won't go down that rabbit hole this evening. There's a couple of similar questions come in from Rupert Knowles and from Eric de la Hart. And we spent a lot of time already this evening talking about increasing carbon levels in your soil, but actually, who wants to take this one? Is there a limit to that, effectively, is what they're both asking. Where's the saturation point, and how close are we to topping out in these soils?
Can I have a go at that?
Go for it.
Eventually, you reach an equilibrium, you reach a balance, and in each soil type will have a different amount, and of course each system that you farm will create the stresses and strains. So if you wanted to really build the biggest carbon system, it would be long-term grassland, and the prairies were 18% organic matters when they first came out. It took 8 years of nitrogen trials before they got a response. So the thing is, it takes a long time to build up for those sort of things. Some of the sand soils that we're probably farming on, as I said, we're probably going to be lucky to achieve 5% because they burn off very quickly. Our principal role in farming is actually to sell carbon. Our offset is carbon, if you like, as grain, and we have to understand that there's a balance in all this. And it was an interesting thought, at some point in the future, because we're comparing with a starting point, at some point in the future, we will develop a system where you will have an equilibrium, where you can't go higher than that, unless you're going to be more intensive at building carbon. So it's, if you're only going to put a cover crop in once every 4 or 5 years, you're not going to achieve very much and keep to your 300 kilograms of nitrogen. If you really want to go down the path of, really dropping nitrogen altogether, capturing all this bits and pieces, you will be actually much more effective. The one area also that's important is that when we start to create fungal-based soils, and at the moment, agriculture and high levels of fungicides are creating bacterial-dominated soils. So once we create the fungal dominance over bacteria, we're going to start to see huge changes, because we can capture and digest and recycle carbon and create humus in a natural way. This is a long-term approach, And I think we just have to run with it. And providing we have the tests that suggest that we're on the trend is to build rather than to reduce, then I think perhaps from our point of view, that's a good thing. We're moving forward.
Thank you, Mike. Question here from Hugh Richardson. Really good one. Who will manage the market for carbon credits? And are they going to be making most of the money? Who's the London Stock Exchange equivalent, I guess, Thomas? At the moment, Agreena is kind of acting as the middleman, but will there, in time, do you think, be an independent platform where buyers and sellers exchange?
Yeah, it's a good question. So at the minute, the carbon market is kind of split into two sectors: the compliance market, which is kind of not allowed, we can't trade in it. But all the things that we're talking about now, as Susan said, is in the voluntary carbon market. And the voluntary carbon market is, the buyers of that is companies that are choosing to do this voluntarily. They're choosing to buy certificates, and they're choosing where to buy them from. So farmers have the super amazing opportunity to have such a good product that's that they're interested in buying. So that's the opportunity for farmers now. And at the minute, the voluntary carbon market essentially is everything's just deals, between buyers and sellers. As a market is. How that's going to look in the future, there's lots of talks within the voluntary carbon market about standardization and kind of fixed pricing and all that kind of thing. I think, I don't know how long away that is, but as we get more and more down and the voluntary carbon market gets more and more established, there's going to be these systems that come in, I think. But at the minute, that opportunity is there. Buyers are, yes, very interested in buying from farms because it has such a good kind of integrity and story. So farmers have that opportunity now to get a good price, really.
Andrew, can I come in on that one?
Please.
I think a bit of governance would do the market some good, actually. I think it would build confidence in both the sellers and the buyers. And I think the government has got a role to play in setting up what that governance looks like. I'm not an expert in governance, so I'm not going to go into the detail on that one, but I think it's needed. But certainly setting out the standards. We've seen with the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code that certainly put sort of some confidence in that market for people to come in and do the buying and the selling. So you know where you are. It might not be perfect, but it does work and it has set the market clearly. And particularly around this discussion around the high integrity aspects, then it means that the buyers know that they're buying something that is not going to end up with greenwash stickers all over their PR desks. So we need to, I think it's really important, that governance aspect, and I would we're urging government to take a lead in that area to make sure that these markets actually get established. They're still in their early stages, and I think the worst thing that would happen is that these markets don't get established for carbon, but also going broader into the wider natural capital.
And I think that, like at COP26, there was so much talk about voluntary carbon markets and how this whole sector is going to evolve. And we've seen there's something called the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market, headed up by Mark Carney, which is starting to come in and put some codes of best practice in place, which I agree with Susan. Like when we get some more clarity, I think, around how the regulation is going to look in the future, that's only going to strengthen the market.
Former head of the Bank of England, we'll have to get him on the next podcast, see what he has to say on the next webinar. A pre-submitted question here from Michael Cutler, and he asks, how can we bridge the productivity gap when changing from destructive chemical-based agriculture to min-till, soil building and ecosystem supporting practices? I'll come to you first on this one, Rob. Effectively, I suppose what Mike's asking in effect is, the income you've got from sequestering carbon so far, has it actually, have you spent more than you've earned?
I suppose the first way to answer that is that the system we were on was a high input, high output system, but it wasn't sustainable. Where we are now, our soils are sort of a little bit in that transitional phase. So certainly yield is down, I would say. We're having a bit of a yield hit in some places. So we saw the carbon market as a way of sort of lessening the blow with subsidies going. If I'm honest with you, that was our driver. How are we going to replace the subsidy? So it's not ever going to fully replace it, I don't think. But it's at the moment it's bridging the gap. So that's how we've seen it. But we're going to use that money to. And the family are very keen to plant trees, for example. So that's sort of one area we're looking at. So that's really our sort of driver at the moment.
Could I make a comment, perhaps? Yeah.
Come on in, Mike. Yeah.
I sort of like the idea. Perhaps we're investing for the future. That's one thing maybe that helps. But I mean, one of the I put two difficult pictures up to begin with, simply because it isn't as easy as just coming in with a cover crop or buying a direct drill and dropping it in. There is a systems approach change, and actually a lot of the farmers that we begin a conversation with, it's trying to figure out where your pros and cons, where your limitations are within a farm, because if you're going to change from one system to another, you have to realize that actually in most cases soils aren't in a state to be able to recover themselves. And so as soon as you go into a system to try to put a cover crop in that you're drilling late and it's full of herbicide, or you've got a crop which is anaerobic and compacted, it's reliant on soil movement to give you the air for it to function. As soon as you come in with a direct drill, you find that the crops slump and go difficult. So I think these things start with a conversation about the farm. I think we have to look at it much more in depth. We have quite a few people that will phone up and say, I'm thinking about buying a direct drill, and you say, well, that's great. It's not the answer. It's part of the answer, the same as a cover crop. And then you ask, well, are the people around you interested? No. So you've got to have, if someone's going to do this, they need a group of people all going to work and discuss towards the system changing, and it ebbs and flows, as soils do. They regenerate and they degenerate according to conditions, and we have to learn to read those conditions and be flexible within our farming package. Having 3 crops on 4,000 acres and putting 300 kilograms of nitrogen, it doesn't fit well to convert into what I call a regenerative package. We have to think very hard about how the farm is going to be structured going forward.
That's obviously, that's the point of the carbon payments, essentially. That's why companies are interested in buying them, because they're interested in help supporting farmers over that complexity gap, I guess, in terms of figuring out how this works on their system. And hopefully the carbon payments can kind of cover that transitional bit.
Tom, I'm very conscious we spent an awful lot of time this evening talking about arable farmers.
Yes.
Rosalie Sanders has asked a brilliant question here. Does Agreena work for permanent pasture grassland systems too? Are you on the hunt for livestock farmers?
So at the minute, we currently work with combinable arable crop rotations, I would define it as. So we've got grass lays on our farm. We can work with rotational grass lays. The bits that we're the kind of two ends of the spectrum that we haven't currently covered, which is kind of heavy root crop, veg crop type land. Obviously because of the soil disturbance complexities, and then right at the other end, permanent pasture that's been there for hundreds of years, proper permanent pasture. We currently don't cover that because of this question around, is it already kind of at its peak carbon? It just takes quite a different system to get there, but we'll get there very soon. I'm sure if she's interested, she can get in touch, and we'll let her know where we're up to in permanent pasture world.
Susan, that's the injustice of additionality, isn't it? Because some of these farmers who farmed, let's say, up in the hills, don't plough a great deal, of quite low stocked, probably from an environmental point of view, of farming in some of the most sympathetic ways. But because of additionality, they're not going to reap many of the rewards in this brave new world, are they?
Yeah, certainly. If you're looking to sequester more carbon, then there isn't much more that they can do. It's already there. I think the ongoing debate is around being rewarded to maintain that store. Now that the carbon markets, I don't know whether that's something that the carbon markets can deal with, or if that's something more about government recognition, because there's a vast amount of carbon stored in the soil. and we need to make sure it stays there, and we need to make sure that it's that as much of this we can continue to sequester where we can, and then maintain it in there. I think that's the real challenge, is to find a sort of a fair way of recognizing the value of people who've already done good stuff. If you've been doing regenerative farming for 10 years and your soil carbon levels are already high, when it comes to selling your carbon under a high integrity banner, which means that you need to have additionality, and it's not just additionality of carbon sequestration. There's also a financial additionality element, which probably not enough time to go into on that one. But it's it is a challenge, I think, for some of the soil carbon, unless you're going from arable to permanent pasture. There's a really good case there, but some of the others, I think it can be very difficult. But like I said earlier, the group that's looking at the UK farm soil carbon code are looking into some of those issues, and hopefully there'll be a resolution found.
I was going to add, I think it's important that grass comes into it. AB14, AB15, especially up north where we have limited options to grow good cover crops without taking a year off. It's an imperative, really, that we have flexibility and options to build. And I just have this wonderful feeling at some point in the future when you can't build more carbon, the question comes back, well, are you farming at your most efficient? And therefore, perhaps you don't need this going forward. I mean, it's not fair in many respects because, but I don't know where income's going to come from when you're at your peak carbon capture, and that's a dilemma, I guess, that one will have to come across in years to come.
And I think that's a complexity that we're having to deal with in the market. We've only been operating a year, so we're still working hard. But additionality is currently something that the voluntary carbon market is tough on, and it is a complex. It's much easier to demonstrate additionality in different other carbon capture technologies, but for soil carbon and farming, it's tricky.
I mean, maybe that's where the government comes in.
That was my next sentence. Yeah. Maybe this is where those. I think it's like Susan said, those kind of storage. Some payment for keeping the carbon that you've put in the ground there. Maybe that should be a government thing. We'll see.
I think so. Yeah.
We're close to running out of time. We've already gone over our 6 p.m. mark, but there's been so many good questions to answer. I just want to end on a practical note. We've had a number of questions that we haven't really got to, so we've been dealing with the big philosophical issues, but we've actually had a number of questions on, people with thinking they've got depleted soils or they want to start that carbon building process. What are the best tips to get started? What are the best plants to grow? And I know it's such a case-by-case basis, but let's have everyone pitch in if they've got any tips for getting started. And Mike, why don't you go first?
Well, I think first off, you've got to think about what your limitations are on the farm, and you've got to have a discussion about that. You've also got to think about, from a cover crop point of view, what can you achieve in the time you have in your farming system, and just putting a multi-cropped cover crop in doesn't necessarily fit. You've got to fit. If you've got heavy soils, you've got to think about what can grow in those conditions, and things like all radish and phacelia fit in very well. If you're going to lighter soils, maybe we can look at more complex options. It's about what you're trying to achieve with the cover crop, and also where one's going, because in the beginning, on a light soil, you might want to put a cover crop in which creates lignin, so that because you want to build organic matter. In some cases, we might want to build nitrogen to reduce inputs from fertilizers. So, and some cases now we're looking at cover crops which actually they're dual cover crops in one. So one goes through the autumn and dies off, releases nitrogen for the other coming into the spring. It also comes back to the fact of what are your following crops. We're beginning to talk about the fact, well, maybe you're not going to come in after a break necessarily for a wheat crop. Maybe you might use that break as a start of your cover crop and then take another overwintered growth period, which means that you would come into spring cropping. And the only way generally we can do this is to have a proportion of the farm into spring cropping to be able to have the opportunity to grow cover crops. So for those who can't establish well in the autumn, that's where I think possibly linseed comes in, because what you can't get growth in the autumn, you might be able to get growth from March, April, May, and direct drill your linseed crop at the end of May, or millet or maize or whatever you're going to do. So we've got to think outside the box a little bit and ask more questions than we're doing at the moment.
Okay. Rob, have you been thinking outside the box for some of these issues?
Well, if you look at the Agreena platform and play around with the strategies, it hates nitrogen. It's not a great fan of winter wheat, but it loves cover crops and spring crops. So if you're out and out going for carbon, you cover crops and spring crops over the whole farm. But in reality, that's never going to work. So from my perspective, it's quite interesting to see how certain soils have responded quite quickly, and we've got other soils which are proving quite stubborn. So we need to look at different scenarios. So we're very much going down a double spring break, which seems to be working quite well. But for us, it's nearly a field by field process now. We've got with blackgrass pressure and all that going on in the background. So the days of big, vast blocks of wheat have gone. It's very much a field by field, and so that's really my take on it, really.
And Susan, you gave us those 6 questions that are sort of left to answer, or each person has to answer. Do you got anything particular to add in closing? Oh, you're on mute, I'm afraid.
Sorry about that. No, I think I'd probably just reiterate what I'd said. So I think the main thing is to be open-minded and to look at it carefully for your own business. I don't think this is a definite yes or a definite no. I think it's what's right for your business, but be open-minded.
Thomas, as our sponsor, then the final word, the floor is yours.
I think the thing to say, Mike summed it up very well. That this is, it's not a simple thing to make this transition. It's a holistic approach, and we know that kind of transitional bit and that holistic look costs some money. So, I would encourage people to just come and have a chat to us and see what opportunities there are for your system and how it might work on your farm.
Okay, fantastic. Well, look, I know we could have spent all of this time allotted with each of our panelists this evening. They've all got great perspectives to share in different ways, but that is about all we have time for this evening, unfortunately. And I know we haven't got even to all of the many excellent questions that have come in, but I hope we've shed some light on what carbon farming is, and crucially, what it isn't this evening, and what's in it for you. Thank you very much to Thomas, Susan, Mike and Rob for their time and expertise, as I say. If you know someone that wasn't able to join us this evening that would find this interesting, then please do remind them it will be available to watch on demand in the days ahead. Maybe not quite straight away, but do go to fwi.co.uk or check our YouTube channel, and it certainly will be up by after the weekend anyway. And if you've enjoyed this webinar in general, please keep an eye out on our social media channels for all the information as to more sessions coming up. There's plenty more in the pipeline. I'd like to thank Laura and Erin, our technical team too, for helping everything run so smoothly this evening. And on behalf of them, the panelists and myself, a huge thank you to all of you for joining us. Hope you have a very pleasant